I told him I wasn't attracted to him anymore while I was drunk. When I woke up, this happened. If I could turn back time and give myself a slap, I wouldn't think longer than a second. Hello, guys. My name is Emily. I'm a 30-year-old woman, and my husband is Luke, a 35-year-old man. We have been together for 3 years. I don't even know where to start with this, so maybe all I can do is just let it out. Let me warn you up front. This is not one of those movies where, at the end, everything begins to go well, as if everything had a silver lining. This is ugly, shameful, and entirely my doing. Let me start by saying that I love my husband, or at least I thought I did. Luke is one of the kindest, most hardworking men I've ever met. He runs his own small business, and even though he's not the flashy type, he's the kind of guy you can depend on. The kind of guy who remembers your favorite coffee order without asking and stays up late, helping you with stuff you didn't even realize you needed help with. But I'm not here to brag about him. Actually, the reason I'm here is because I managed to ruin everything we had. All of it. It all started last Friday. My night out happened in the evening after work, and that was what I considered a girl's night out. There was wine, beer, spirits, just about everything being served. And to be truthful, I was a little tipsy by the time I got home. I was feeling high, both from alcohol and from, I don't know, bitterness, insecurity. Who even knows what goes on in your head in 5 minutes? Luke was waiting for me when I got home. He'd stayed up late because he wanted to make sure I got back safe. And what did I do? Instead of thanking him, I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "I'm not even attracted to you anymore." Yeah, I know. What kind of person says that to their husband? The worst part, I didn't even know I said it in the first place. The next morning, I woke up with blurred vision and indistinct thoughts, feeling like my head was going to burst into flames. Luke was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the carpet as though his heart had been ripped out of his chest. His first words to me were, "Is this what you really think of me?" And that is when it all fell apart. Luke and I met about 4 years ago at this little cafe downtown where he worked as a manager. I still remember the first time I saw him. He was standing behind the counter, wearing this plain button-up shirt and the kind of tired smile that told me he'd had a long day. I wouldn't call it love at first sight. It wasn't anything like that. He wasn't my type at all. I mean, he was cute in a way, but not in the tall, fit, charming way that usually caught my attention. Luke was different. Quiet. Dependable. Honestly, just a bit ordinary. I did not pay much attention to him at first. We exchanged a few words one day when I went in during a lunchtime. He saw that I had left the napkins behind, and instead of just passing them to me, he cracked this little joke. "Either you're saving the world now, or something." It wasn't hilarious or anything, but at least I laughed. Of course, I suppose that's where it all began. At the time, I wasn't really looking for a relationship. I had just come out of a messy breakup with this guy who, looking back, was all looks and no substance. My friends were always teasing me about my bad taste in men. One of them even said, "Emily, maybe it's time to stop going for the flashy guys and find someone who actually treats you right." I guess Luke fit the bill. He wasn't flashy or overly confident, but he had this way of making you feel safe. Several weeks went by while both of us would visit the cafe occasionally. One day, he invited me out. That's right. I recall even taking some time to think before responding. I wasn't sure whether I was physically attracted to him or not, but I told myself, Why not? I was done with always searching for men who were infatuated with me, but had no regard for me as a person. And Luke, he cared. That was clear immediately. We dated for about a year and a half before he proposed. It wasn't anything grand, no big romantic gestures or fancy dinners. He just took me to our favorite park one afternoon, pulled out a ring, and said, "You're my best friend. I can't imagine life without you. Will you marry me?" It wasn't the kind of proposal you'd see in a movie, but it felt right. So I said yes. The whole first year of our marriage was fine. Great. Even. Luke was all the things that I believed I needed in a boyfriend. He was indeed a good friend, very dependable, friendly, and always found time for me despite his job becoming hectic. I had never felt more loved. Yet somewhere along this process, the slide began. I can't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but little cracks began to show. It wasn't like we were fighting all the time or anything. It was more subtle than that. I started noticing things I hadn't before, like the way his shirts didn't fit quite right, or how he never seemed interested in working out. I told myself it didn't matter, but part of me wondered if I had settled too soon. Looking back, I cannot say when it happened, but at some point, I started to perceive Luke differently. It wasn't like he suddenly transformed into a completely different person, or did something wrong that I found disagreeable. He remained the same good-natured man I had wedded, but something in me shifted. Perhaps it was the numerous brunches I had with my friends. Conversations revolved around things like, "Have you seen how much weight I bench pressed today?" Or, "Evan took me on a weekend getaway without even asking. Check how healthy he is in this photograph." Then they would turn to me, and I would feel that sinking sensation in the pit of my stomach. Don't get me wrong, Luke was great in a lot of ways, but in those moments, all I could think about was how we didn't fit the picture-perfect image I wanted. I'd scroll through Instagram and see couples smiling at the gym or on exotic vacations. Then, I'd look at the few pictures I had with Luke. He wasn't photogenic. He always looked stiff, and his clothes never seemed to sit right. It wasn't fair, but I started wishing he looked different, taller, fitter, more something. Instead of appreciating him, I began to find petty, insignificant things to quarrel about. If he wore a shirt too tight on the belly, I'd say, "Maybe that shirt is too tight, sweetheart." Or if he went back for more food at the table, I would chuckle, "Well, you are certainly making up for it tonight." I thought I was being clever. Now, I see those little remarks probably hurt him more than I understood. Luke noticed the change, of course. He wasn't oblivious. He'd ask, "Is everything okay with us?" Or, "You've been kind of quiet lately." I'd brush it off every time. "I'm just tired." Or, "Work's been stressful." The truth was, I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling because it didn't make sense. Even to me, I loved Luke, or at least I thought I did. But in my head, I was building this version of him that didn't exist, and every time he fell short of that imaginary standard, I grew more frustrated. Things started to snowball. I began to focus so much on all his moves, as if I had developed a paranoid attitude towards him. If he sat on the couch too long, I'd think to myself, "Why doesn't this man exercise?" If he discussed what happened at work, I'd glaze over just as fast. It was too mundane, too uninteresting for television. It was ridiculous. I know that now, but at the moment, I couldn't stop myself. I was comparing him to men that resided in my imagination, men that I had probably never met in real life. It didn't help that my friends weren't shy about sharing their opinions. One time, after brunch, my friend Jenna pulled me aside and said, "Emily, you're gorgeous. You could have ended up with anyone and you chose Luke. Not to be rude, but don't you ever think you settled?" I laughed it off, but her words stuck with me. Did I settle? Was I trying too hard to convince myself that Luke was enough? Luke wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve to be treated the way I treated him. I began putting relational space between us, without consciously deciding to do so. I would sit around with friends, or just occupy myself on social networks, liking pictures of happy couples, and thinking, we clearly aren't that. If Luke attempted to set a date night, I would come up with reasons. I'm tired, or perhaps next week. No, it wasn't geographical space that began to matter. I started emotionally distancing myself. One night, he asked me point blank, "Do you still love me?" I froze. I wanted to say yes, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I said something vague like, "Of course I do. Why would you even ask that?" He didn't push, but the look on his face told me he wasn't convinced. That was Luke's thing. He never pushed. He was calm, patient, and understanding. But instead of appreciating that, I started seeing it as weakness. I wanted him to fight for me, to demand answers, but he didn't. He just let me pull away, and in my twisted mind, I blamed him for that too. I am not sure how I came to feel this way. Perhaps I was self-actualizing him, or maybe I was attempting to ruin the best thing I ever had because, deep down, I believed I didn't deserve it. That is all I know. The more I tried to ensure that we remained out of each other's lives, the more Luke struggled to let me go. And the more he clung, the more I yearned to escape. That night started like any other, a girls' night out. My friends and I had planned to meet up at a bar downtown just to catch up and unwind after a long week. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a drink or two, maybe some laughs, and then home by midnight. But somewhere along the way, one drink turned into 3, then 4, and before I knew it, I had completely lost track of how much I had drunk. The music was loud, the conversations were flowing, and honestly, I wasn't thinking about anything except how nice it felt not to worry about my life for a change. What I didn't realize was that I was a complete wreck by the time I got home that night. After midnight, I could hardly stand, let alone reason properly. Luke was still up when I drunkenly made my way inside. Like he always did, he had waited until I got home safely. That's the kind of person he is, always reliable. And instead of even saying thank you to him or responding courteously, I did the unthinkable. Worse, I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I know I was slurring my words, my emotions bubbling over in a way that only happens when you've had too much to drink. At some point, I looked at him and said, "You're not even attractive to me anymore." Just like that. No context, no explanation, just those cruel, cutting words. All I can recall is waking up the next morning with a terrible headache and an overwhelming sense of regret. Initially, I didn't see anything wrong. I thought it was just another hangover, another day of the week. However, the shift in the atmosphere was sharp and entirely unexpected, especially when I entered the kitchen. Luke wasn't his usual self. No cheerful, "Good morning," no preparation of coffee. He just sat there, silent and cold, like I wasn't even in the room. I wondered if we had even spoken the night before or if I had imagined it. But the way he barely acknowledged me told me everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was clipped, distant. I asked if something was wrong, and he just looked at me like I was a stranger. That's when it started to sink in. Something had happened, something bad. It wasn't until the end of the day that I gathered the courage to ask him directly. He didn't yell or get angry. That's not who Luke is. Instead, he just stared at me with those stunned eyes as if I had just slapped him and said, "Do you really think that about me?" My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to deny it, to tell him it wasn't true. But how could I? I didn't even remember saying it, and the fact that those words had come out of my mouth, drunk or not, meant there had to be some truth to them, right? I tried to explain myself, to brush it off as just the alcohol talking, but Luke didn't buy it, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. When Luke asked me if I actually meant what I had said, if I truly wasn't attracted to him anymore, I froze. He just sat there, waiting for an answer, and my mind blanked. After what felt like an eternity, I murmured an apology, insisting that it was just the liquor talking, and that I didn't mean it. But even as I said it, I felt how weak it sounded. Luke didn't argue or yell. If anything, that almost made it worse. He simply nodded slightly, like he was processing my words, and said, "I need some time to think." Then he walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen with a pit growing in my stomach. The next several days were odd, distant, detached. Luke never mentioned the incident again, but everything between us changed. He began building a wall around himself, cutting me off as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Overnight, he started going to work early and returning late. He claimed he had a lot of business to handle, but I knew better. At home, he spoke to me only when necessary. The little things I used to cherish, his random questions about my day, the funny stories he would share, were gone. And in their place, a cold silence settled between us, growing thicker with every passing day. It was like he was there physically, but checked out emotionally. He stopped asking about my day, stopped laughing at my jokes. He wasn't rude or mean, but his silence was deafening. Every glance felt colder, every response more distant. It's hard to explain, but it was like living with the ghost of the person I had married. The guilt began to set in each time I looked at him, consuming me little by little. It had been more than just what I had told him that night. It was about everything, the way I had let resentment build up, the little digs at his appearance, the emotional distance I had created long before this happened. And now I was paying for it. I tried to fix things. I cooked his favorite meals, even though I was terrible at cooking. I left little notes in his lunch bag, like I used to do when we first got married. One night, I even tried to initiate intimacy, hoping it would bridge the gap between us. But every time, he just gave me this sad, tired look, like he wanted to say something but couldn't. And then he'd say, "I'm not in the mood," or "maybe another time." It hurt, but I couldn't blame him. I had started this mess. That stress was not missed by anyone around us, including those watching from the sidelines. My friends noticed it almost right away, or at least the more observant ones did. Once, during one of our brunches, Jenna turned to me. "Is everything all right between you and Luke? You seem off." I brushed it off as a phase, but she wasn't convinced. "Are you breaking up?" she asked, her face full of doubt. A few days later, frustration got the better of me. and I finally told her about it, if that's even the right way to describe it. I explained the night I got drunk, the things I uttered, and the changes that followed. Jenna didn't sugarcoat it. "Emily, you should have been more careful," she said, her voice low so the other girls wouldn't hear. "You know, Luke's a sensitive guy. Stuff like that, especially coming from you, sticks with him. You need to fix this before it's too late." I nodded, but her words only added to the weight on my chest. I knew she was right. But how do you fix something when the other person has already started pulling away? The silence was the worst part. He didn't scream at me, didn't argue, didn't say a single word that could be translated into an accusation. He just existed in a way that stung worse than if he had exploded. It was as if we had come to a silent agreement that I wasn't worth turning his head around for. That realization crushed me. I started overthinking every little thing I did. If I laughed at a TV show we were watching, I'd glance at him to see if he was annoyed. If I asked him about his day and got a one-word answer, I'd wonder if I had pushed too hard. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own home, constantly trying to prove to him, and maybe to myself, that I was still the person he fell in love with. One night I tried to bring up the conversation again, hoping we could finally clear the air. "Luke," I started cautiously, "about the other night. I'm really sorry, Before I could finish, he cut me off. "Emily, I've heard your apologies. I just need time, okay?" His tone wasn't harsh, but it was final. I nodded and dropped it, but inside, I felt like I was losing him more with every passing day. I kept telling myself that I just needed to be patient, that he'd come around eventually, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something had shifted between us, and I didn't know if it could ever go back to the way it was. It was a Friday night, and I just couldn't handle the silence anymore. Luke had barely spoken to me all week, and when he did, it was as if every word took effort. The house felt suffocating. I knew I was the reason for all of it, but I didn't know how to fix it. So instead of staying home and facing the mess I had created, I decided to go out. I told myself I just needed a breather, a night to clear my head. But deep down, I knew I was running away. I texted Jenna to meet me at the bar, but she had plans with her husband. Figures, right? Everyone seemed to have it together except me. I went alone, telling myself it wasn't a big deal, just a drink or two, and then I'd head back home. But once I got there, the loneliness hit me like a brick wall. The couples laughing, the groups of friends clinking glasses. It all made me feel so small. I ordered a drink, then another, trying to drown out the guilt that wouldn't stop gnawing at me. That's when he showed up. I didn't notice him at first, but he slid onto the bar stool next to me and said, "You look like you've had a long day." He had this easy smile, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. He wasn't overly handsome, but he carried himself with confidence. I couldn't help but smile back. We started talking, and it was so effortless. He asked about my job, laughed at my stupid jokes, and told me I had the prettiest smile he'd seen all night. It was such a stark contrast to the cold silence I'd been living with at home. I knew I shouldn't have been entertaining it, but for the first time in weeks, I felt seen. As the night went on, the drinks kept coming, and the line between innocent conversation and something more began to blur. He wasn't aggressive or pushy, just charming in a way that made me feel wanted. At one point, he leaned in closer and asked, "Do you want to step outside? It's getting loud in here." I hesitated, but eventually nodded. I told myself it was harmless. We were just going to talk outside. The cool night air hit me like a wake-up call, but it wasn't enough to stop what happened next. We stood by his car, talking and laughing, and he said something about how he couldn't believe someone like me was out alone. I don't even know what came over me, but before I knew it, I was leaning in, and so was he. And then we kissed. It wasn't a passionate, movie-worthy kiss. It was clumsy and fueled by a mix of alcohol and bad decisions, but in that moment, it felt like everything I'd been craving: attention, validation, a break from the weight of my guilt. It felt wrong, but I didn't stop. The sound of a car pulling up broke the spell. I pulled away, laughing nervously, and turned to see who it was. And there he was, Luke. He was sitting in his car, just watching us. My heart sank. He didn't get out or yell or do anything dramatic. He just sat there with this look on his face, disappointed, almost disgusted. I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like I was someone he didn't even recognize. The guy I'd been talking to noticed my reaction and followed my gaze. "Do you know him?" he asked, looking between Luke and me. I stammered, "That's my husband." His face immediately dropped. He took a step back and muttered, "I didn't know you were married." I wouldn't have, but I wasn't listening anymore. My focus was on Luke. I started walking toward his car, panicking. "Luke, wait," I called out. But he didn't say a word. He just rolled up the window and drove off, leaving me standing there in the middle of the parking lot like an idiot. The guy from the bar tried to apologize again, but I waved him off. "Just go," I said, barely holding it together. He didn't argue and quickly disappeared back into the bar. I was alone, my heart racing, my mind spinning with all the ways I'd screwed up. I couldn't believe what I'd just done. I got in my car and tried calling Luke, but he didn't answer. I must have called him 5 or 6 times, but nothing. By the time I got home, his car wasn't in the driveway. The house was dark, and his keys were gone. That's when it hit me. I might have just destroyed the last bit of trust he had in me. And this time, I didn't think I could fix it. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My head was pounding, my stomach was in knots, and the events from the night before were playing on a loop in my mind. I barely got any sleep after what happened. I kept hoping Luke would come home, that maybe he'd cool off and we could talk it out. But he never did. When I walked into the kitchen, there he was, sitting at the table with his arms crossed. He looked like he hadn't slept either, but his face was too calm. That was Luke's thing. He didn't explode or yell when he was upset. He just got quiet. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence can be so much worse. Before I could even say anything, he looked up at me and said, "We need to talk." His voice was steady, but his words felt like a punch to the gut. I sat down across from him, my hands trembling, and tried to find the right thing to say, but before I could open my mouth, he started. "You made it clear last night that you don't respect me or our marriage," he said, his tone cold, but controlled. "You've been pulling away for months, Emily. I've been trying to ignore it, hoping we could work through it. But what I saw last night..." He paused, his jaw tightening. That was the final straw. I felt my throat close up. "Luke, it wasn't what it looked like, I swear. I didn't mean for any of that to happen. My voice cracked, and I could feel the tears starting to well up. I was just... Don't. He cut me off, holding up his hand. Don't make excuses. You kissed another man. You chose to do that, Emily. And even if you didn't mean for it to happen, it did. And I can't come back from that. I broke down, the weight of everything crashing over me. I'm so sorry, I sobbed. I messed up. I know I did. But I love you, Luke. Please, just let me make it right. He shook his head, and for the first time I saw his eyes glisten, though he didn't let a single tear fall. I gave you everything I had, and it still wasn't enough. I don't even know who you are anymore. He exhaled sharply and stood up. I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Emily, but it won't be with me. Those words hit harder than anything he could have yelled at me. I wanted to argue, to plead with him, but I could see it in his face. He was done. This wasn't just anger or hurt. This was final. He stood up and walked toward the door. I'll pack my things and move out by the end of the week, he said, his voice steady but distant. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the separation. Luke, please, I begged, following him to the door. Don't do this. I'll do anything to fix it. Just tell me what to do. He turned to look at me one last time, his expression blank. You can't fix this, Emily. You broke it, and I'm not staying to pick up the pieces. And then he was gone. The days that followed were some of the worst of my life. True to his word, Luke packed his things and moved out by the end of the week. He didn't argue or fight. He didn't even ask for anything except his clothes and a few personal items. The house felt empty without him, and I spent most of my time crying, replaying every mistake I'd made in my head. When his lawyer reached out about the separation, it felt like the final nail in the coffin. Luke wasn't dragging things out or leaving room for reconciliation. He was cutting ties, plain and simple. I signed the papers in a daze, barely able to process what was happening. I tried reaching out to him a few times after he moved out, hoping he'd at least agree to talk, but every call went straight to voicemail and every text went unanswered. It was like I'd become a stranger to him, someone he wanted no connection to, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. I had disrespected him, our marriage, and everything we built together. I thought I was trying to fix us, but all I did was push him further away. And now, I was left alone, staring at the wreckage of a life I destroyed with my own hands. Update. It's been a little over 6 months since Luke walked out of my life, and honestly, not a day goes by where I don't think about how badly I screwed things up. He's moved on now, and from what I've heard, he's doing better than ever. He's dating someone new, who's not only drop-dead gorgeous, but also seems to genuinely make him happy. I caught a glimpse of her once by accident when I ran into them at the grocery store. She was laughing at something he said, and he looked free, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He's thriving, opening a new business, and from what I hear, she treats him like a king. Meanwhile, I'm here in a studio apartment, wondering how I let it all go. The apartment is tiny and depressing, to be honest. My parents helped me move in after the separation, but even they seemed more disappointed than supportive. My mom didn't sugarcoat it. She said, "Emily, you had everything most women dream of, and you threw it away. I don't even know who you are anymore." That hurt, but she wasn't wrong. I've had a lot of time to think about where I went wrong. It's not just the cheating or the hurtful things I said. It's the way I let my insecurities get in the way of something real. I was so focused on what other people thought, on wanting a perfect life that looked good on the outside, that I completely overlooked what I had: a stable, loving relationship with someone who truly cared about me. Now, I'm the one people whisper about. Even my friends have distanced themselves. Jenna said her husband didn't want her hanging out with me because I'm a bad influence. That stung more than I expected, but again, I can't blame him. I've become the cautionary tale, the person people point to and say, "Don't end up like her." I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for what I did, but I'm trying to move forward. If nothing else, I hope someone hears my story and learns from it. If you have someone who loves you for who you are, don't take it for granted. You might not get a second chance. Looking back, I know I've lost Luke for good. There's no fixing this, no going back to how things were. And honestly, I've made my peace with that. I had something so rare and valuable, a man who loved me unconditionally, and I let it slip through my fingers because of my own insecurities and shallow fears. If I could go back and undo it all, I would. But life doesn't work that way, does it? I've spent a lot of time reflecting on everything. At first, I wanted to blame the circumstances, the pressure from friends, or even Luke's lack of change. But the truth is, I have no one to blame but myself. He was everything I could have ever asked for, but instead of appreciating that, I let my own self-doubt and vanity poison our relationship. I can't change the past, but I can own up to it. I hope my story serves as a lesson for someone out there, anyone who might be in the same place I was. If you have someone who loves you for who you are, don't let your insecurities ruin it. You might not get a second chance. Trust me. The grass isn't greener on the other side, and chasing after some unrealistic version of perfect is the quickest way to lose something real. To Luke, if you ever hear this, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need to say it. You deserved better than what I gave you, and I hope you found that now. I hope she treats you the way I should have. And to everyone listening, thank you for sticking around to hear my story. Be kind in the comments, or don't. I probably deserve whatever you have to say. This isn't one of those tales where the narrator gets a happy ending or redemption. It's just reality, and sometimes reality is messy and painful. But it's mine, and I'm learning to live with it. That's it for me. Take care of the people you love and don't take them for granted. Bye for now.